If you close your eyes and picture the Second World War, specifically the early years of the German Blitzkrieg, a specific image almost certainly comes to mind. It is the image of the German infantryman. He is clad in field grey, the eagle on his chest, his helmet low over his eyes. And in his hands, held tight against his hip, is a weapon that looks less like a rifle and more like a machine from the future. It is compact. It is made of cold, stamped steel and dark bakelite. It has a folding stock that snaps shut with a mechanical finality. To the Allied soldiers in 1940, the British trapped at Dunkirk, the French breaking under the weight of the panzer divisions, this weapon was the physical embodiment of the enemy. It was the Submachine, the burp gun. A weapon that seemed to represent everything the Wehrmacht stood for: efficiency, modernity, and ruthless mechanical perfection. For decades, Hollywood and history books have reinforced this legend. In every movie, from The Longest Day to Indiana Jones, the bad guys wield this gun with terrifying precision. It became the symbol of Nazi industrial might. It was slick. It was controllable. It was mass-produced. It was the weapon that conquered Europe. But there is a twist to this story. A twist that the propaganda films didn't show, and that the Hollywood movies ignored. The German soldier holding that weapon knew something the rest of the world didn't. He knew that the perfect machine in his hands, the envy of the Allied armies, was hiding a dirty secret. He knew that behind the futuristic stamped metal and the terrifying rate of fire, there was a fatal flaw. A single, catastrophic engineering oversight that could leave him helpless in the mud of Russia or the hedgerows of Normandy. They laughed at the clunky American Thompson. They mocked the crude British Sten gun. But by 1943, the German soldier on the Eastern Front would have traded his perfect MP40 for a Russian submachine gun in a heartbeat. This is the story of the MP40. It is the story of how a weapon defined an era, changed the way wars were fought, and then, in the freezing hell of Stalingrad, betrayed the very men who trusted it with their lives. To understand why the MP40 failed, we first have to understand why it existed. And to do that, we have to go back to the mud and blood of the First World War. In 1918, the German Empire was looking for a way to break the stalemate of the trenches. The bolt-action rifle, the standard weapon of the day, was a dinosaur. It was long, heavy, and slow. In the tight, claustrophobic confines of a trench raid, missing your first shot meant you were dead before you could cycle the bolt for a second one. The Germans needed a trench broom. They found it in the MP18, the grandmother of all modern submachine guns. It was a heavy, woodstock beast, but it fired pistol ammunition fully automatic. It changed the psychology of combat. Suddenly, a single soldier could suppress a squad. But when the smoke cleared and the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany was stripped of its military. They were forbidden from developing these rapid-fire weapons. The technology went underground. During the interwar years, while the rest of the world slept, German engineers were quietly refining the concept. And this is where we meet the first irony of our story. The gun is famously known as the Submachine by Allied troops. But Hugo Submachine, the legendary weapons designer, had almost nothing to do with the MP40's creation. The real father of the MP40 was a man named Heinrich Wüllmer. Wüllmer was a genius of simplicity. In the 1930s, as Hitler rose to power and the drums of war began to beat again, the German army, the Wehrmacht, realized that the next war would not be fought in static trenches. It would be a war of movement. Blitzkrieg. Lightning War. They needed a weapon for the paratroopers jumping out of junk as transports. They needed a weapon for the tank crews squeezed into the tight hulls of panzers. They needed something small, light, and devastating. The old woodstock submachine guns were too heavy and too expensive. They were made like Swiss watches, machined from solid blocks of steel. That took time. And time was the one thing the Nazis didn't have. So, they did something radical. They turned to a manufacturing method that was considered cheap and nasty by traditional gunsmiths: metal stamping. Instead of carving a gun out of steel, they would use heavy hydraulic presses to punch parts out of sheet metal, folding them like origami. It was the IKEA approach to weaponry. The result was the MP38, which soon evolved into the MP40. When it was unveiled, it was a shock to the system. It had no wood. None. It was all steel and plastic, specifically Bakelite, an early synthetic. It had a folding stock, the first of its kind on a standard infantry weapon. It was sleek, ugly, and undeniably modern. To the German high command, it looked like the future. To the German soldier, it felt light and handy. But hidden deep inside the blueprints, in a component that seemed too simple to mess up, a time bomb was ticking. September 1, 1939. The German army rolls into Poland. The world watched in horror, but military analysts watched with fascination. For the first time, they saw the doctrine of Blitzkrieg in action. And at the tip of the spear were the shock troops, the Panzer Grenadiers, wielding the MP40. The weapon's performance in the early years of the war was nothing short of spectacular. And we must give credit where it is due, the MP40 was a joy to shoot. If you read the memoirs of American soldiers who later captured these guns, or British commandos who stole them, the feedback is almost always the same. The MP40 was smooth. This was due to a brilliant piece of engineering called the pneumatic recoil buffer. Most submachine guns of the era, like the American Thompson, fired very fast, about 800 rounds per minute. They were hard to control, climbing up and to the right. But the MP40 fired slowly, about 500 rounds per minute. Inside the gun, a telescoping piston assembly cushioned the blow of the bolt moving backward. It was a soft recoil. A German soldier could hold the trigger down and stitch a line of bullets across a target 50 yards away without the muzzle climbing into the sky. It was a surgical instrument compared to the blunt hammers of the enemy. In the invasion of France in 1940, the MP40 became a psychological weapon. Allied soldiers, armed with bolt-action rifles from the previous war, felt woefully outgunned. They heard the distinctive chug-chug-chug-chug of the MP40 and felt the panic rising. It sounded like a machine that would not stop. It was during these glory years, 1939, 1940, early 1941, that the legend was built. The MP40 was the star of the newsreels. It was the weapon of the victor. But victory has a way of masking flaws. When you are moving forward, when your supply lines are working, when the sun is shining and the dust is low, a weapon doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. The German army was about to learn a hard lesson. A weapon designed in a sterile engineering office in warm, Central Europe behaves very differently when you drag it into the deepest, darkest corner of the map. June 1941. Hitler turns his gaze east. Operation Barbarossa begins. 3 million German soldiers march into the Soviet Union. At first, it was just like France. The Wehrmacht smashed through Soviet lines. The MP40 stuttered its rhythm of death across the Ukrainian steppes. But then, the environment began to fight back. Russia is not France. The dust in the summer is a fine, abrasive powder that gets into everything. It coats your skin, your eyes, and the oiled moving parts of your weapon. German soldiers began to notice something disturbing. When the MP40 got dirty, it stopped working. The tight tolerances that made it so accurate, so perfect, were its undoing. There was no room for grit. But the real shock came not from the dust, but from the enemy. In the early battles, the Germans encountered Soviet shock troops armed with the PPSh-41. The Germans called it the balalaika because of its drum magazine. The PPSh-41 was everything the MP40 was not. It was crude. It was finished roughly. It looked like it was made by a blacksmith in a hurry, because it was. But it had a chrome-lined barrel. It fired at a blistering 900 rounds per minute. And most importantly, it had a magazine that held 71 rounds. The German soldier, with his superior MP40, had a magazine that held 32 rounds. Imagine the scene: a German squad clears a house in a burning Russian village. They round a corner and come face to face with a Soviet squad. The German pulls the trigger. Chug chug chug. He fires for 3 seconds, and his magazine is empty. He has to fumble for a fresh stick, reload, and rack the bolt. The Soviet soldier, meanwhile, just keeps shooting. He has double the ammunition capacity. He creates a wall of lead that the German cannot penetrate. For the first time, the Larians with their high-tech weapons felt inferior. Memoirs from the Eastern Front are filled with a strange phenomenon. German soldiers, the elite of the Wehrmacht, began throwing away their MP40s. They would scour the battlefield for dead Russians, picking up the PPSh-41s. They loved the Russian gun so much that the German High Command eventually had to issue official manuals on how to use the captured enemy weapons. Why? Why would the soldiers of the most advanced industrial nation on Earth prefer a crude Russian tractor-factory gun? Because the MP40 had a secret. A fatal flaw that was getting good men killed. To understand the fatal flaw of the MP40, we have to look at the one part of the gun that Heinrich Vollmer didn't design. The one part that was a holdover from the old days. The magazine. The MP40 was a masterpiece of stamped steel innovation, but for some inexplicable reason, the German army decided to keep the magazine design from the older MP38 and MP28. This magazine was a double-stack, single-feed design. Let me explain what that means without getting too technical. Inside the magazine, the bullets sit side by side in two columns, double-stack. But at the very top of the magazine, the metal tapers inward, forcing those two columns to merge into a single bullet sitting in the middle, single feed, waiting to be pushed into the gun. This seems like a small detail. But in the world of physics and friction, it is a nightmare. Because the bullets have to be forced together under high spring pressure, there is immense friction at that tapering point. If there is any dirt, any dust, or any ice in the magazine, the friction becomes too great. The spring gets stuck. The bullets stop moving up. You pull the trigger. The gun fires once. The bolt flies back. It comes forward to strip the next round, and grabs nothing but air. Click! The gun jams. In the chaotic, dirty reality of war, this happened constantly. Soldiers learned that they couldn't load the full 32 rounds into the magazine. If they did, the spring tension was too tight, and it would jam. So they only loaded 28 or 30. They were handicapping their own firepower just to make the thing work. But there was another part to this fatal flaw. It wasn't just the internal mechanics, it was the ergonomics. The MP40 was designed to be held by the pistol grip and the forend. But in the heat of battle, when a soldier is terrified and adrenaline is dumping into his system, he instinctively grabs the most solid thing he can find to steady his aim. On the MP40, the most convenient thing to grab was the long magazine sticking out of the bottom. It felt like a vertical foregrip. It felt natural. But the MP40's magazine well was loose. If a soldier grabbed the magazine and pulled it backward towards him, which is a natural instinct when you are controlling recoil, he would tilt the magazine slightly. This tilt misaligned the feed lips. The bolt would come forward and smash into the brass casing of the bullet instead of pushing it into the chamber. Jam! German training manuals screamed at the soldiers, "Do not hold the weapon by the magazine." They even printed it on the cards issued with the guns. But human nature is stronger than training. In the panic of a firefight, soldiers grabbed the mag, and the gun died in their hands. Compare this to the American Thompson or the British Sten. They used double-stack, double-feed magazines. The bullets didn't have to merge into a single line. They fed from both sides, like a zipper. It was a robust, idiot-proof design. You could drag a Thompson through the mud, load it full, grab it by the magazine, and it would still fire. The Germans, in their quest for precision engineering, had over-engineered the gun but under-engineered the box that fed it. If the dust of summer exposed the cracks, the winter of 1942 shattered the MP40's reputation entirely. As temperatures dropped to -40 degrees outside Moscow and Stalingrad, the oil inside the MP40s turned into glue. The tight tolerances between the stamped metal parts, which made the gun so accurate, now meant that there was no room for the frozen sludge. A soldier named Hans, writing a letter home from the Stalingrad pocket, described the frustration: "The automatic weapons are useless. We have to urinate on the bolts to thaw them out before the Russian attacks. By the time they are firing, the Ivans are already on top of us." Meanwhile, across the lines, the Russians were using a lubricant made of gasoline and gun oil that didn't freeze. Their loose, rattling PPSh-41s kept spitting fire. There was also a safety issue, a terrifying quirk of the open bolt design. The MP40 fired from an open bolt. This means that when the gun is ready to fire, the heavy metal bolt is pulled back, held by a sear. When you pull the trigger, the bolt flies forward, hits the bullet, and fires. But the MP40 safety mechanism was rudimentary. It was just a notch cut into the receiver that you hooked the bolt handle into. As the war dragged on, the tracks for the bolt handle wore down. If a soldier jumped off a truck, or dropped his MP40 on its buttstock, the inertia could jar the bolt loose from the safety notch. The bolt would fly forward. The gun would fire. And because it was an automatic weapon, the recoil would cycle the bolt back, and it would fire again. And again. There are tragic accounts of entire squads being panicked because an MP40 fell over in the back of a half-track and emptied its entire magazine into the men sitting opposite it. It was a weapon that could kill you just as easily as it could kill the enemy. As the war turned against Germany, the MP40 became a symbol of a failing philosophy. The Allies were producing weapons that were ugly, cheap, and effective. The American M3 grease gun looked like a mechanic's tool. It cost about $20 to make. The British Sten gun cost about $10. They were stamped out by the millions. They were crude, but they worked. The MP40, while cheaper than the old wood guns, was still too complex. It took too many man-hours to make that folding stock. It took too much precision to make that telescoping recoil spring. By 1944, Germany was bleeding out. They couldn't produce MP40s fast enough to replace the ones lost in Russia. They tried to simplify it, but the core design, and that fatal magazine, remained. The ultimate irony came in the final year of the war. The Germans finally introduced the weapon that would change history, the STG-44, the world's first assault rifle. It was everything the MP40 should have been. It used a powerful intermediate cartridge. And, crucially, it used a modern, curved, double-feed magazine. But it was too little, too late. In the ruins of Berlin, 1945, you would see the Volkssturm, old men and young boys, defending their capital. And in their hands, you would still see the MP40. The weapon that had marched triumphantly into Paris was now being used in a desperate, losing last stand. The sleek black finish was gone, replaced by rough grey phosphate. The plastic was brittle. And the soldiers holding them were no longer the confident Aryan supermen of the propaganda posters. They were terrified civilians, clutching a weapon that looked futuristic, but was technologically a generation behind. So why do we remember the MP40 as perfect? Because history is often written by the aesthetic. The MP40 looks right. It has a menacing elegance that the Thompson lacks. It defined the visual language of the bad guy. When George Lucas needed a weapon for the stormtroopers in Star Wars, he based their blasters on the Sterling, a British gun that was a direct descendant of the MP40's aesthetic. But the reality of war is not aesthetic. It is functional. The MP40 was a triumph of industrial design and a failure of battlefield reality. It was a weapon built by engineers who understood stamping presses, but didn't fully understand the mud. It teaches us a vital lesson about technology in war: complexity is the enemy. Comfort is a trap. The German soldier, shivering in a foxhole in 1944, frantically tapping his magazine against his helmet trying to jam his weapon as the enemy closed in, knew the truth. He knew that the legend of the Schmeisser was a lie. He knew that the weapon in his hands was a masterpiece of a bygone era, a perfect machine for a war that no longer existed. And in the end, the fatal flaw wasn't just in the magazine. It was in the mindset of a regime that believed technological superiority could overcome the gritty, chaotic, overwhelming reality of the world. They believed they could engineer their way to victory. But as the MP40 clicked empty on the frozen fields of the East, they realized that in war, perfect is the enemy of good enough.